Hi guys, Dr. Rob Barrington here with some more nutrition advice. I'd like to talk today about the nomenclature of meat and eggs. It's sometimes confusing when you go to buy animal produce as to exactly what you're buying. There's organic, there's non-organic, so that's conventionally grown meat. There's grass-fed, and there's also free range. So I thought it would be a good idea just to go through the different labels that you can find on animal products in order to be able to make it absolutely clear what you're buying. If we look at vegetables, plant products, they tend to fall into two categories. They'll either be organic or they'll be non-organic, conventionally grown. And that's quite simple. Conventionally grown plant foods are grown with a range of pesticides. Those pesticides obviously have to have been deemed safe by the authorities, and they have particular concentrations that they're allowed to be present within the plant foods. Organic produce from plants tends to have a much smaller range of pesticides that are allowed, and those pesticides tend to be not organic chemicals. They tend to be products that are deemed perhaps to be a little bit safer. So with plant foods, you tend to know what you're getting. You're either buying organic food or you're buying non-organic food. But with animal products, it's a little bit more complex, and the nomenclature actually overlaps. So you can buy free-range organic, you can buy free-range non-organic. So what do the labels mean? What are we actually buying when we buy these products? Well, if we start with conventionally grown livestock, including eggs and meat, what you tend to find is that the animals are fed on grain, and grain is a very good way of fattening animals. However, when the animals eat this grain, they tend to convert much of the starch within the grain into saturated fat. Now, that means that the meat is very high in saturated fat, and that gives taste to the meat, and it also adds weight to the animals, and that is profit for the farmers because the animals are generally sold on a weight basis. Now, the grains that these animals are fed are generally non-organic, so they will contain pesticide residues themselves. The animals are also given supplements and drugs in their feed, and the pesticides in their food and the drugs and the supplements, any fat-soluble substances within those conduits into their food will be stored in their fat. So not only do conventionally grown livestock have high amounts of saturated fat, they tend to accumulate drugs and chemicals within that fat. And that's really the disadvantage of eating conventionally grown livestock. They tend to have these residues within their meat, and the meat is generally of low quality because they've been fed on grain. Now, livestock can also be fed on organic grain, and then the meat would be called organic. There would also be a limit, for example, on the types of growth drugs that they're given, and therefore organic meat is a slight improvement over conventionally grown meat because there should be fewer pesticide and drug residues within it. However, they are still fed on grain. So organic meat, even if it's or labelled organic, if it's grain fed, there may still be high concentrations of saturated fat within the meat. Now, the high concentrations of saturated fat in themselves are not a problem. What we tend to find, though, is that when animals are fed on grain, they tend to have too much omega-6 fat in their diet, and their diets tend to be almost devoid of any omega-3 fats. So not only is the fat within grain-fed livestock mainly saturated, any of the essential fats that are present within that fat will generally be omega-6s. Now, this is problematic because generally people eat too much omega-6 fat and not enough omega-3 fat. So if you consume this type of meat, you are adding to the problem inherent in Western diets, that there is too much omega-6 and too little omega-3. So I would suggest that grain-fed organic livestock is slightly better than conventionally grown grain-fed livestock, simply because there should be fewer drug and pesticide residues within the meat. However, the actual quality of the meat is still very low. Just because it says organic on the package does not mean that that's going to produce any health benefits in those that eat it. So what do we have to move towards in order to be able to find a higher quality product? Well, the next best type of meat that you would find would be grass-fed. Now, the difference between grass-fed livestock and grain-fed livestock is that grass is really the natural food of these animals, and therefore they're eating a diet that's actually more natural to them. They will sometimes be supplemented with grain at certain times of their lives, but generally they're fed mainly on grass. This grass contains alpha-linolenic acid, and that alpha-linolenic acid allows them is an omega-3 fat, and it allows them to incorporate omega-3 fats into their meat. So therefore, when you tend to look at grass-fed livestock, you tend to find that the essential fatty acid ratio, the omega-3 to the omega-6 ratio within the meat, is much more favourable to human health, and that makes it a higher quality product. In addition, because they're not fed grains, they don't tend to have such high fat levels. They tend to be leaner. The meat tends to be of a higher quality with less saturated fat, and therefore the meat is of a higher quality. Now, there have been some studies that have looked at farm-raised animals and wild animals and compared the essential fatty acids within the meats, and generally wild animals contain much more omega-3 fat within their meat and their milk than farm-fed animals, for obvious reasons. They're eating a natural diet, and their natural diet contains omega-3 fats. Grass-fed livestock are much closer to their wild counterparts than the grain-fed animals of traditional, conventional farming. So that improves the meat quality. If you can eat grass-fed beef, any grass-fed animal, we're talking about livestock obviously, then you will improve the quality of your health, because you will be eating a higher quality product. Now, as with grain-fed or livestock, grass-fed livestock can be either organic or non-organic. If the produce is labelled as organic, it means that the grass that the livestock have been fed was grown without the use of pesticides, and therefore there are fewer pesticide residues within the meat. So grass-fed is generally a higher quality meat product than the grain-fed livestock. And if you buy non-organic grass-fed, you're probably actually getting a higher quality product than if you buy organic grain-fed produce. So you've got to be careful. Just because something is labelled as organic doesn't necessarily mean it's actually a healthier product. Now, if we go to free range is another label that you often see on produce. Now, it's most often associated with eggs, but you can obviously have free range anything, because free range simply means that the livestock are allowed to roam within certain limits freely, and this means they tend to find other sources of food. If we go to chickens, for example, if you put a chicken in a cage and you feed it grain and you feed it a very controlled diet, the end product, the meat or the eggs that it produces, will reflect the quality of that diet. And if that diet is very limited, which it often very often is in conventional farming, you will produce a very limited nutritional profile within that meat product or the eggs. Free range is superior because the chickens tend to go and find their natural foods. They tend to eat grubs, they tend to eat insects, they tend to eat things that provide them with the nutrients they require to make healthy eggs and to produce healthy birds. So the end product from free range tends to be much higher quality nutritionally compared with battery or conventionally grown. And the same can be said for livestock. Livestock will go out and they will generally try and find foods that they would naturally eat. So free range is a much better way of allowing livestock to feed themselves, because you obviously do feed them, you give them supplementary food, but they are also allowed to go and find their own natural foods. In this respect, free-range eggs, free-range chickens have a much better nutritional profile. Again, studies have looked at free-range eggs and compared them with battery eggs, and guess what? The essential fatty acid content of free-range eggs is much superior to those of battery eggs. And this is because the natural foods of chickens, when they're out and they're foraging, it tends to allow them to accumulate more omega-3 fats in their eggs. Now, it is understood that the diets of chickens is related to the eggs that they produce, and in some cases battery chickens are fed high omega-3 content food in order to increase the omega-3 content of their eggs. So again, this is a grey area, because battery raised eggs can, if the chickens are fed high omega-3 content food, can actually have higher omega-3 content than free range. However, generally, if you look at the health of the chicken and the nutritional content of the egg, free-range eggs tend to be nutritionally superior to battery eggs generally. Now, of course, free-range can also be organic. If you have free-range organic, it means that the food that is supplied to the chickens is of a type that has been grown without the use of pesticides. So organic free-range eggs are very similar to normal free-range eggs, apart from there should be fewer pesticide and drug residues within them. So if we have a look at the hierarchy of the types of the quality of the foods that you get from these different categories, conventionally grown livestock, conventionally grown eggs, let's say battery eggs, let's call them battery eggs, these types of meats and these eggs tend to be of the lowest nutritional quality, and they're not dangerous in themselves if you eat them in small quantities, but they won't really provide you with a wide range of nutritional products that you might require for your diet. If you rely on them entirely, I'm not saying they will make you unhealthy, but they certainly have a lower nutritional quality than some of the other categories. The next best category really to consume would be anything that's labelled organic. Organic will simply assure you that there should be fewer pesticide and drug residues within the final product, although drugs are still given to organic animals and pesticides can be used, but there's more of a limit on the quantity and the range that are allowed to be applied to the foods. The nutritionally most superior types of products would be those that are labelled grass-fed or free-range, particularly if they're also organic. These types of foods tend to have the highest range of nutrients within them. They tend to have the best nutritional profiles, but that is reflected in the fact that they tend to be more expensive. The price has come down in recent times, but they are more expensive. Now, it's very difficult when you're eating out, you're eating at friends' houses, to always consume these high quality products, and I would have to emphasize that eating conventionally grown meat is not going to kill you. It's not really damaging to your health if you have it occasionally, but everything in nutrition has to be in balance. If you can afford the extra cost of organic free range grass fed products, I would very much recommend that you consume them, but you shouldn't worry if you can't afford them. If you have a limited budget for your foods, try and try and buy them when you can, when you have the extra money. Now, it's more important probably to try and eat organic and free-range grass-fed meat than it would be, for example, to eat organic fruits and vegetables. Drug and pesticide residues tend to be more dangerous, higher levels. They tend to accumulate more in meats because of the fats there than they do in, for example, in grains or legumes or fruits. So if you are on a limited budget, I would suggest that you do try and buy the highest quality meats that you can, the highest quality eggs that you can, and if you have to therefore rely on conventionally grown fruits and vegetables, that is probably a better way of doing it. But don't worry too much if you have to eat conventionally grown livestock and eggs. Eggs are still very nutritionally sound. Even battery-raised eggs are nutritionally sound. Personally, I don't like battery eggs because of the way the chickens are kept. I think that's possibly the reason that I would not eat them. And likewise, you could say the same thing about certain conventionally raised livestock. Generally, a happier animal tends to produce higher quality meat and higher quality eggs. So if you can afford it, I would try and go for the grass-fed organic or the free-range organic eggs and meat. If you can't afford that, try and find a good source of grass-fed meat. You might be able to find a local butcher, for example, that sells grass-fed beef and various other products. Free-range eggs now are actually quite cheap. They're not much more expensive than battery eggs because consumer demand has started to increase the market for them. But if you have to sometimes eat conventionally grown meat, don't worry too much, but it's not a very good source of omega-3s. So if you are relying on conventionally grown meat, battery eggs, you will have to find another source of omega-3s in order to balance your omega-3 to omega-6 ratio, and you need to take that into account. Whether or not there haven't really been long-term studies that have been done to find the health benefits of these different categories of food. So a lot of this is inference and supposition. However, if we look at nutritional papers that have been done, generally those people who eat higher quality foods tend to be healthier. Those people who spend more time selecting specific products that have higher nutritional content tend to be healthier. The less pesticides, the fewer pesticides, the fewer drugs that are present in your meat, the better. And the real problem with pesticides and drugs is that although they're tested in these meats and are found to be safe at particular levels in isolation, very, very few studies have actually shown what type of synergistic effects they have. There is evidence that the dangers actually comes when you mix these drugs and chemicals together. Pesticides in isolation may be safe, but when there's 5 or 6 of them in the meat, they tend to have synergistic effects biochemically, and that makes them actually quite dangerous. So I would suggest that if you can, you try and avoid conventionally grown livestock and battery raised eggs, and if you can afford it, I would try and go for the organic free range and organic grass-fed livestock and eggs, because I think it will improve your health in the long term.